90% of the population has glucose spikes every day without knowing it. And so I dove into the research and I discovered that actually there were things I could do, principles I could use that would allow me to avoid glucose spikes while still eating all the foods that I love.
Today, we're going to get into everything glucose and managing glucose in a healthy way in our bodies. But before we do that, we're going to get into all kinds of hacks, how we can, help make that transition from eating to glucose hitting our body as smooth as possible and stop that from being such an erratic thing. But first, let's talk about what happens when glucose spikes in our body.
Yeah, absolutely. So 2 main things happen that make a glucose spike harmful for your body. Number 1 has to do with your mitochondria. So as glucose floods into your bloodstream and your cells, it heads to your mitochondria. And there, unfortunately, your mitochondria kind of shut down under such a big influx, a big tsunami of glucose to deal with. Your mitochondria then become stressed. They send out free radicals. These free radicals lead to inflammation, and that creates a lovely terrain for all chronic diseases. Number 2, when there's a lot of glucose in your body, this reaction called glycation happens at a faster rate. Glycation is aging, and it's actually similar to cooking. It's what happens when you put a piece of toast in the toaster and it goes from white to brown. That's glycation, that's toasting, that's cooking. And in your body, from the moment you're born, you start toasting. And then when you're fully toast, you die. And with every glucose spike, you're accelerating that process of aging. Last thing that happens in your body, every time you have a glucose spike, your body is going to send out insulin to grab excess glucose and store it away in your muscles, in your liver, and then in your fat cells. And that's one of the ways that we put on weight. Anyway, that's the biology underpinning everything, but we feel glucose spikes on many, many levels.
Well, let's get into the details. We've gotten into the nitty-gritty of the science. You've talked about, weight gain can be, at the end of the physiology there. But let's get into some of the other conditions that can come up if people are spiking their glucose on a chronic basis.
Yeah, so the most common symptoms that people report are unsteady energy levels. So feeling tired throughout the day, having cravings, so craving sweet foods between meals for dessert, being hungry all the time. So being hungry every 90 minutes. You just ate a couple hours ago, but all of a sudden you're famished again. Then impact on your skin, so wrinkles, acne, rosacea, any inflammatory disease. Impact on your sleep, poor sleep. You wake up, you're not rested. Weight gain. Impact on your fertility. So, worsening polycystic ovarian syndrome symptoms or difficult menopause. This is especially true in women. And then long-term, the development of conditions like prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, and a favorable terrain for cancer, Alzheimer's, and heart disease. So, the summary is that glucose spikes really are to be avoided, and we feel it instantly in a matter of minutes, but it's also really important for our long-term health.
And for somebody listening, saying to themselves, I feel generally good, my weight is generally quote unquote good. How many people are affected by this?
90% of the population has glucose spikes every day without knowing it. And that's really the fundamental reason that we should all care about it. Because even if, you're healthy looking on the outside, whatever that means, by the way, could you feel better than you currently do? That's the question you should ask yourself. Could you feel more energized? Could you feel more steady throughout the day? Could you improve your relationship to food? Could you sleep better? All of these questions are really important. And what I've seen in myself and in the community that I've created is that everybody benefits from flattening their glucose curves.
Well, let's talk about what we mean by a glucose spike, because naturally when we ingest a meal, it's going to affect the glucose levels unless, we're having maybe pure fat or something like that. But mostly when we're having a meal with a variety of different things, our glucose level is going to be impacted. So what constitutes when that's too much and it becomes a problem?
So I'm going to explain where glucose comes from and where you get it in foods. So glucose is originally created by plants during photosynthesis, and it's then turned into either fiber or sugar or starch. And as a human, the way for your cells to get glucose, because glucose is your body's preferred energy source, so it's very important to get some, the easiest way we get glucose is by eating either starchy foods or sweet foods. So starchy foods, we're talking about bread, pasta, rice, potatoes, etc. And then sweet foods, we're talking about desserts, anything sweet like fruit, etc. And since glucose is your body's main energy source, you might think like, oh, well, I should just eat more glucose and I'll have more energy. But that's actually not the case. It's a bit like if you give a plant too much water and it drowns. When you give a human body too much glucose, problems start piling up. So there's no like specific line about like this is okay as a quantity and just here is too much glucose. We just know that overall we want to reduce the variability of the glucose spikes in our body, get them to be a bit smoother so that we can feel better and we can heal.
You got into a little bit there, the difference between starch and sugar. Let's get into the nuance there a little bit deeper because the sugar from those two different sources is different in the body. So I'd like you to get into the details.
Yeah, of course. So glucose exists, as I mentioned, in starchy and sweet foods. But there's one key difference, which is that in sweet foods, you also have fructose. And this is very important because if you just looked at the glucose response of a starchy food and a sweet food, you might see the same glucose spike, but the sweet food also has this invisible fructose spike that you cannot see on a glucose monitor. And it's very important because fructose is even worse for our body than just glucose. So it glycates things faster in your body, makes you age quicker. It causes more inflammation. It causes more likelihood of type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, etc. So starchy and sweet foods are not the same. And that's why one of the hacks that I share is that it's always better to pick a starchy or a savory food over a sweet food because of the presence of fructose.
And you talked about the invisible fructose spike that we're going to have when the glucose spikes in the case of having a sweet food. There's also an invisible insulin spike when we have
absolutely.
glucose. So let's talk about that factor as well.
Yeah, so your body's way to respond to a glucose spike is to release insulin. And insulin, has gotten a bad rep, but actually we need insulin to live. And people who don't have the ability to make insulin, people with type 1 diabetes, they have to inject multiple times a day to make up for what that pancreas can't produce. So insulin gets released after every glucose spike. And what it does is it takes the glucose and it stores it away in these different storage containers. Unfortunately, same thing as, the water for the plant, too much insulin also causes issues. So too much insulin over time is the main driver of prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. So while it's useful, one of the great consequences of flattening your glucose curves is also reducing the amount of insulin in your body.
Let's get into insulin resistance. And I love the analogy you share in your book talking about at a different chapter in your life when you were addicted to caffeine and you kept upping your caffeine just to get to that baseline level of energy.
Yeah.
Talk about what was happening in the body with the caffeine and how that relates to insulin.
I mean, I don't know if you've experienced this, but I go through phases of drinking coffee and not drinking coffee. And what I find is that if I haven't had coffee in a month, let's say, and I have, a tiny little shot of espresso, I'm wired. And then I keep having, an espresso every day. And then after a week, I'm like, I'm not really feeling that energized. I need another shot. And you build up what's called tolerance. So your body does not respond to the substance as quickly, as intensely as it did before. And so when I'm done with my coffee phase, I can have like 3 coffees a day and I still don't feel as energized as I did on that very first day. So then I stop coffee altogether. I'm like, okay, time to readjust and to let my body become resensitized to that molecule. The same thing happens with insulin. So insulin's job is to help glucose get into the cells. Unfortunately, over time, when a lot of insulin is released, you need more and more insulin to do the same job. Your cells, your body has become slowly resistant to insulin. And you see this because you see fasting insulin levels rise and rise and rise and rise. And then at some point, your fasting glucose level will start rising as well. A lot of insulin in the body is a precursor to conditions like prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. It happens years before you get diagnosed with those conditions. And too much insulin in the body is just a really big alert symbol that your metabolism is starting to suffer and that you're on the road towards those conditions. And then also in people who have ovaries, too much insulin in the body is also a key driver of a lot of deregulation, hormonal deregulation that can cause issues.
And the crazy thing is when people have type 2 diabetes, they end up injecting insulin and then they're just furthering the problem and continuing that cascade.
It's a bit like if you said, okay, well, Jessie, 3 cups of coffee is not waking you up anymore. And if you said, just drink more coffee. And, that would work, quote unquote, but I'm still becoming more and more resistant to caffeine. I'm not solving the underlying resistance issue. And so, often when somebody has type 2 diabetes and they haven't been able to manage it, you start getting insulin. And so insulin temporarily brings glucose levels down, but those insulin levels are still really, really, really high. So a lot of other problems accumulate and you're not solving the baseline issue, which is too much insulin and insulin resistance or being insulin desensitized.
Well, the good news is for somebody who is on that path and maybe they're type 2 diabetic and they're injecting insulin right now, we're going to give a whole bunch of hacks. We've already given one, but we're going to get into a lot of solutions that get to the source of the problem. So within your community, how often do you see people that go from being type 2 diabetic to not needing insulin over time after applying what we're going to talk about today?
That's hard to say. What I can tell you is that in these clinical trials, this has been effective. In my community, I get messages every day of people who've used the hacks, but not just for type 2 diabetes, It's actually, I would say it's a pretty small fraction of my community who are people who have diabetes. A lot of people gravitate towards the hacks and use the hacks because they just want to feel better. They just want to have more energy. They just want to have clearer skin. They want to solve their fertility issues. They want to lose weight. They want to help their mental health. A lot of those things. It's not just for diabetics anymore. Of course, if you're somebody with diabetes, these hacks will help you. And the studies that I base my work on have been done in the first place on people with diabetes because that's the condition that we associate with glucose. So that's been the focus for a long time, but now we know that's shifting and that it's actually for everybody.
Well, before we get into more of the hacks, let's talk about your story and how you got into the science of this and you've uncovered all these hacks that are helping so many people. Your story into this world, if we go way back to the beginning, involves a trip to Hawaii with some friends, and you ended up jumping off a waterfall and having a compression fracture of your spine.
Yeah,
so I'll have you take the story from there and talk about how that led over time to where you are today.
Yeah, at the time I had no clue it was going to lead to any of this, but what it started in me was this very intense desire to feel better. Like I was broken. I was super depressed, super anxious, had a lot of mental health issues after the surgery. I was really, really struggling. I didn't want to live. It was fucking brutal. And so I was like, I need to figure out how to heal. I need to figure out how to communicate with my body, how to get it into place where I feel like I'm showing up as my optimal self and I'm not just like this shell of a human. So I went to study biochemistry in grad school. And then I went to work in the field of genetics, always trying to understand, how does my body work? How can I speak with it? How can I understand what my body needs? And while I was working in genetics in San Francisco, I had the opportunity to put on a glucose monitor, which is a device that has been designed and developed for people with diabetes. And I put one on as a non-diabetic. And I saw a few things that really changed my life and that led me to talk about glucose all day like I am today. So number one, I saw that glucose spikes were happening in my body and that I was not diabetic, but that these spikes were really big. And I learned that 90% of us have these glucose spikes happening in our body every day without knowing it. And that was like, whoa. Second, I was able to trace that glucose spikes were one of the triggers for my mental health episodes. So I saw one day, I had this condition called depersonalization, which super sucks and is like a weird feeling of being terrified about existing and just like intense terror and anxiety and fear and whatever. And so I saw one day that as one of these episodes was coming on, I scanned my glucose monitor and I saw that it was coinciding with this massive glucose spike from a really sugary breakfast that I had just had. And so then I started connecting the dots. I was like, oh, what I'm eating is influencing my glucose, which in turn is influencing me, how I'm feeling. So I thought, well, I got to learn how to avoid these glucose spikes. And I understood the concept that glucose came from starches and sugars. And I also knew I didn't want to give up pasta and chocolate cake because they make me happy. And I just love them. And so I dove into the research and I discovered that actually there were things I could do, principles I could use that would allow me to avoid glucose spikes while still eating all the foods that I love. And that was really revolutionary. And so I started sharing it with my friends and family after healing myself. And then, it's been helping so many people since. And now, on Instagram with the book, I'm super happy that more people are getting access to the science.
You mentioned a couple times now the continuous glucose monitor. It's something I'm a big fan. I'm actually wearing one right now, and I just like to, as a healthy person, see where my glucose spikes and how my body's reacting to different foods. Because something we could get into is everybody as an individual is going to react differently to the same foods. But what I want to talk about first for people that are tuning in right now and they haven't used this technology, talk about how it works specifically with your phone and what you see in real time to be able to apply these changes to your diet to impact your glucose.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to preface this by saying, so I've worn a glucose monitor for, many years now, and I've used the data from it to illustrate the scientific studies that talk about glucose. But in order to get the benefits, you don't need to wear one. They're expensive still, and they're still in early stages of developing in terms of being a really general public device. The data is still difficult to understand if you don't have the context. And so you can get a lot of the benefits by applying the hacks and not necessarily wearing one yourself. But when I wore one and when somebody wears one, what you can really see is how when you eat, let's go to one of the hacks actually. If you eat a meal that contains vegetables, proteins, fats, and starches. And if you eat that meal in one order or another order, you'll see a very different glucose spike happening on your glucose monitor. And that's, one of the really cool hacks that I share. And the right order to eat your food in is vegetables first, proteins and fats second, and starches and sugars last. And if you do it this way, you can curb the glucose spike by 75%, which is super easy and incredibly valuable. And then to your question about personalization, I just want to touch on that because I think it's really interesting. A lot of people have asked me that, like, isn't it true that bodies react differently and you can't really draw any general conclusions? And actually, the science shows us that these hacks, these principles, they work in every single one of us. And if you want to go a step further and figure out, for you, maybe this particular type of cookie versus that type of cookie will have a different response in your glucose. That's totally fine. But you're going to get at the 20% of variability between people. The 80% of how to keep your glucose level steady is by applying these very straightforward principles that work in everybody. Did that answer your question? Sorry, I went on a tangent.
There's a lot of good stuff in there. But what I want to highlight is what you said there at the end where, the principles that we're going to get into and have been touching on are going to work for everybody in a general sense, but we still have the individual variability. And why I get into that is because you share a story in the book. A friend of yours and yourself, you both had, it was either ice cream or a cookie.
Both.
And you had, or both together, and you had a big glucose spike when you looked at your CGM, and she had one on as well, and she didn't have the same spike. So again, we could apply what we're going to talk about to those, to both you guys in that scenario and bring the glucose spike down, but you're still going to have more of a reaction to that food versus her to the same food.
Yeah, and it can be due to so many things, Jessie. It can be due to your hydration level, how much muscle mass you have, what part of your menstrual cycle you're in, how hydrated you are, how stressed you are, how rested you are, your microbiome. I mean, like there's a lot of stuff going on there. And we're just scratching the surface for sure.
Well, let's get deeper into the hack you share, because you went over it there in a general sense, but there's a lot we can get into and share the nuances. So when we're eating in a certain order, it's going to have up to a 70% difference on our glucose spike, which is huge.
Yeah.
And the order we want to eat are vegetables first, protein and fat, and then the sugars or starches at the end. Let's talk about the physiology of what's happening there when the glucose is being, not totally nullified, but brought down in a huge way.
Yeah. So this has to do with two things. Number one, the fiber in the vegetables. So when we eat fiber first, the fiber in the veggies, as it lands in our stomach first and then makes its way to our upper intestine, it creates a mesh in our upper intestine, this sort of protective mesh. And that mesh stays there for a couple of hours. And what it does is that it helps your body not absorb too much of the glucose and fructose molecules coming down afterwards. So you have, you absorb the glucose from the meal to a lesser extent, and you also absorb it slower. Second, the proteins and the fats, if you have them before the starches, they slow down the speed at which food moves from stomach to intestine. So you're essentially slowing down the tsunami of glucose. And with the fiber mesh, you're protecting your body from even absorbing too much of that glucose in the first place.
And you give a great analogy in the book and share pictures of a sink and explain the stomach as being the bowl of the sink, and then the intestines being the pipe that it goes into as the water goes down. So I thought that was a really good picture to kind of visualize what's happening there. But let's talk about the fiber piece. You mentioned the mesh that forms and how that can protect us from, the glucose and the fructose from, going through and spiking the blood sugar. What happens when we do something like juice or blend or do something else in processing that affects the fiber? And even we can use the example of a smoothie. If we're pulverizing all that fiber, how does that affect the way digestion works?
So, I actually want to talk about fruits. Let's take an example. Let's take a whole orange versus an orange juice versus an orange smoothie. So first of all, we have to remember that the fruit that we eat today is actually not natural. The fruit we eat today has been bred for centuries or millennia by humans to be extra sweet, extra juicy, and give us extra pleasure when we eat it. And in fact, the oranges that we often refer to as this natural piece of fruit, that's actually, it didn't exist 4,000 years ago. The oranges were invented in Asia 4,000 years ago by breeding together different types of pre-existing fruit. Bananas today, much bigger, much sweeter than ancestral bananas, which are about this big and full of seeds. So that's step one. Let's keep in mind that fruit has been bred to be way more full of sugar than nature intended. Second, of course, if you want to eat something sweet, a piece of whole fruit is still the best thing to eat because it contains fiber. And fiber is protective. So yes, there is sugar in the fruit, but because the whole fruit also comes with this protective fiber, you don't absorb it as quickly. It doesn't create such a big glucose spike. The problem when we juice an orange, for example, is that as we juice it, we're removing all the fiber, like all the solid material that we're removing, that's the fiber. And we're just extracting the sugar. So we're removing this foundationally protective part of the whole fruit by just simply removing the fiber. And so we're getting a massive glucose and fructose spike, and all that's left is the sugar. Now, if we smoothie the orange, we can peel it and then smoothie it. It's not as bad for your glucose and fructose levels as the juice because the fiber is still there. But as you smoothie it, you're pulverizing it into much smaller particles that can't do their job as effectively as before.
Got it. I think that's important because a lot of people in the health and wellness space, like to have smoothies, especially for breakfast, and think that they're doing something great for themselves. And again, it's on a continuum. It's not saying that
Exactly. It's a
smoothies
spectrum.
don't have a place. We don't want to scare people away from making a smoothie, but there is that physical change to the fiber when we're pulverizing that way.
Yeah. And also, if you want to have a smoothie, so the least good option is going to be a smoothie that's just a fruit smoothie. You can make a really good for your glucose levels smoothie by having a smoothie that also contains proteins and fats, right? You can add some protein powder, you can add some nut butter, you can add some fruit for taste. Let's remember that for breakfast, starches and sugars should be there for taste and for pleasure. I know I've talked about the fact that every cell in your body needs glucose for energy. It's your body's preferred energy source. But actually, even if you don't eat things that contain glucose, your body will make all the glucose it needs from within. So we don't actually have to eat glucose to live. And we certainly do not have to eat sugar to live because that contains fructose that has zero biological purpose. So in the morning, starches and sugars for taste, but build a breakfast or a breakfast smoothie around protein, fat, and fiber.
Okay, we got to talk about one aspect of this hack, and that's the fact that we say have carbs at the end, which would be the fruit. And a lot of people in the health and wellness space say if you're going to have fruit, have it by itself or have it at the beginning of the meal so it can digest through and we're not clogging up the system with the heavier foods and having it rotting on top. So you've looked at the science on this and debunked it, and I think it's important we discuss.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. So I heard that many times that, oh, well, if I eat fruit last, it's going to rot. And so I was like, what is this? Like, what is this belief? What is this belief? Where does it come from? And I found out that it comes from the Renaissance. This doctor during the Renaissance said that if you eat fruit last at the end of your meal, they will putrefy and rot sitting on the top of the rest of your food in your stomach. Turns out he was just off the wall. Like there's no scientific evidence backing this. Nothing can rot in your stomach. And even if, it would be possible, it would take days to happen. So if you look at the modern science, it's clear that it's best to eat fruit at the end of the meal because of a lesser impact on glucose levels. However, I have heard a handful of people who've told me that they can't eat fruit after a meal because it makes them feel a bit bloated. If that's the case, like by all means, listen to your body always. But for the rest of us who don't really feel a difference, it's always better to eat it after some protein, fat, or fiber than on its own.
And one of the hacks in your book that fits into this and ties in is putting clothes on your carbs. So if you're somebody that is going to have, say, a piece of fruit and it's midday and you don't really have anything in your system digesting at that time, you can add something to that to impact how that glucose is going to spike. So this is a really cool hack. Talk about what we can add to carbs to slow that glucose spike down.
Yeah. So carbs are starches and sugars, as I mentioned. And clothes or clothing is fiber, fat, and protein. So the concept is never eat your carbs naked. That is, never eat them on their own. Always try to add some clothing to them. So the best clothing to add is fiber, because the fiber is protective again. So the best thing to do if you're having, for example, pasta, is to add some broccoli in it, add some sauteed, spinach, whatever contains fiber. Then you can also add protein, super good piece of clothing. So anything, animal or plant-based protein, and then fat. However, don't go as far as to add a massive slab of, I don't know how many ounces of butter on a piece of toast. Like, yes, that'll slow the glucose spike, but also too much fat is not the best. So we have to be a bit mindful of how much fat we add as clothing to our carbs. But overall, this is really helpful because this allows you to stay full for longer. You don't create this cravings roller coaster after eating naked carbs. You help your body, you help your long-term health and your short-term feelings.
So the way I'm seeing this, it's kind of like what we talked about before, where you're ordering your food, having the fiber and then the protein and fat and then the carb. Mm-hmm. In this case, you're just mixing it together. So ideally, would it be a better scenario if somebody picked that apart and actually took time and had them each separate instead of mixing it with the carbs?
You're totally right. So it's a spectrum, right? So on the best to worst for our glucose levels spectrum, Best for your glucose levels, always have your fiber, protein, and fat before your carbs. Middle, have them all mixed together. Worse for your glucose levels, have the carbs first or have the carbs alone. So you decide where you lay on this spectrum. You don't have to go all the way every time, but try to think, could I go a little bit more this way next time? What do I need to do that?
We can talk a little bit about breakfast here. We talked about smoothies, again, being something that a lot of people do have for breakfast in the health and wellness space. But let's talk about growing up what you had for breakfast every day, which was Nutella on a crepe, which is going to totally spike blood sugar.
Absolutely.
But now one of the hacks, and you've moved towards this, is having a savory breakfast. So talk about how that can make a big difference when it comes to the glucose.
So the science shows us that if you take 2 breakfasts of equal number of calories, so it's not about the calories, one is sweet, one is savory. The sweet one is going to make a big glucose spike in your body. You're going to be hungry again faster, you're going to have cravings for the rest of the day, and you're going to have less available energy for your body. Second one is savory, so smaller glucose spike. You feel full for longer, your energy is steadier, you help your body short-term, long-term, and things go well. So it's a really simple thing to keep in mind. In the morning, nothing sweet. You can still have starches, so you can still have bread or whatever, but avoid sweet things. The best time to eat something sweet is as dessert at the end of a meal, not first thing in the morning when you're fasted.
Well, let's further pick that apart. So if you're I like this one, because if you're going to have something sweet, you just mentioned, have it as dessert.
Yeah.
And one of the other hacks, again, tying in, is not to have that as a standalone. If you're going to don't have a snack, rather save that snack or whatever it is you want to have that's sweet and have it after a meal, because it's going to have a better impact on your glucose.
Exactly.
Talk about the nuances there.
Yeah. So it's interesting because, getting your glucose levels in a good place is not about cutting out all of the carbs from your diet. It's about learning when and how to eat them so that the impact on your glucose levels is lessened. So in this case, for example, you're walking around and you pass by this store and you're like, ooh, this cookie looks really, really good. Pick up the cookie, but don't eat it right then on an empty stomach. Keep it for dessert after your next meal. That way, during your day, you're still having the pleasure and the positive impact on your, whatever brain chemicals of that cookie. But if you have it at the end of a meal, because of everything else in your stomach, the impact on your glucose will be much, much smaller. So you'll create less inflammation, less aging, etc. It's not about necessarily changing what we eat, but how we eat has a big impact as well.
We've already gotten into the nuances of the difference between starches and sweets, but let's talk about sugar across the board here. There are so many different things different words for sugar that they sneak into different processed foods.
Yeah.
And you make the argument that all sugar in the end is the same.
Yeah.
Let's talk about this, because a lot of people in the health and wellness space think, this is okay, I can have this dessert because it's coconut sugar or honey or agave. So let's really get into the nuances here and talk about these different quote unquote healthy sugars and how people are basically tricking themselves thinking that they're doing something good for their body when they pick something like honey.
This is the thing, when you eat sugar, it's for pleasure only. Like, it doesn't make sense to pick one sugar over another for health purposes because they're all exactly the same. So you take regular sugar, castor sugar, brown sugar, coconut sugar, agave, maple syrup, honey. These are all just glucose and fructose molecules. But we have these health halos around like, agave or coconut sugar. It's BS. It's just total BS. And in fact, you know how I mentioned that you have glucose and fructose in sweet foods and that fructose is worse? So in table sugar, it's 50% glucose and 50% fructose. In honey, it's 30% glucose and 70% fructose. So actually, honey is worse for your body than table sugar because fructose is worse for your body than glucose. And then you might think, oh, but the antioxidants, right? The antioxidants in honey, that's good, right? Again, myth. There are as many antioxidants in a tablespoon of honey as there are in half a blueberry. Honey is not the best place to go if you want to have antioxidants. The best place is berries or vegetables, etc. So we kind of get confused around choosing different sweeteners or sweet things based on these perceived health halos, but really it doesn't matter. If you love honey, great. If you prefer table sugar, great. When you have something sweet, pick the one you prefer. There isn't one necessarily that's going to be super healthy and the other one's super bad. They're all in the same family.
Wow, this is seriously mind-blowing for me because I've avoided sucrose or table sugar totally for years.
Yeah.
So you're saying if you go to a place and have a dessert, if honey is a sweetener or sucrose and you have the option, there's
sucrose.
Really no different. Yeah, sucrose, because you're going to have less fructose, which is...
Then you have to look at how much they're putting, right? So maybe they would say, we put less honey because it's sweeter than table sugar. So at equal quantities, table sugar is better for you than honey. But if they're putting less honey, anyway, yes. Sorry, I was trying to go into the nuances, but yes, 100%.
So for somebody who's like, okay, I get this now, but I have my morning coffee and I have to have something sweet in there. Is there any of these natural sweeteners that are good for people, or at least neutral?
Yeah, so monk fruit, allulose, stevia, erythritol, these are things that taste sweet, but don't contain any glucose and fructose molecules, do not impact your insulin or your glucose levels. So they're pretty good options to use, actually. They're going to be way better for you than using the quote-unquote real stuff. And on sweeteners, again, sweeteners get a bad rep. People think, they're artificial, they increase cravings, etc. The thing is, real sugar increases your cravings way more than artificial sweeteners. Now, of course, if you don't already have artificial sweeteners in your diet, you don't need to add them. They're not going to bring any health benefits. But if you're trying to consume less real sugar, definitely using one of those is a good idea.
And for somebody who is consuming a lot of sugar right now, but they're intrigued and they want to lessen that and hopefully apply a lot of these hacks, do you recommend to people just to cut it out cold turkey? Or is there a certain protocol? Because talk about the addictive nature of sugar and how people that have been consuming it for a long period of time actually have an addiction to this food-like substance.
Yeah. So the addiction piece is quite interesting, and there are many factors at play. But what we know from the science is that when your glucose levels are low, which they usually happen after every spike, the craving center in your brain activates and tells you, eat something high calorie, eat something sweet. And so for a lot of us, we're on this addiction roller coaster, and it's really hard to get off it. And when we have these cravings, we feel ashamed about them. We try to use our willpower to combat them, and it becomes this very intense tug of war. When actually what you need to do is step off and say okay, let me solve the underlying issue, which is my glucose levels going up and down all the time. So use the hacks I share. And once you do that, you'll notice that these cravings are just not really there anymore. And then when you want to eat something sweet, it'll be because of pleasure or joy, or you have this really nice chocolate cake that you really want to eat tomorrow, and no longer this sense of being controlled by sugar, no longer this sense of you're just a puppet and your brain just wants to eat sugar all the time. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And going cold turkey, if you want, but again, that's going to be super tough. Your cravings are still going to be there. Your glucose is still going to be going up and down. So it might be really challenging. What I found successful for me and for people in the community is focusing on the hacks, savory breakfast, eat your food in the right order, etc., to solve the underlying issue so that the cravings kind of dissipate as a consequence.
And spinning off the breakfast thing there and having a savory breakfast, let's talk about intermittent fasting, because this is such a popular piece right now in the health and wellness space, and it comes up all the time on the show. It's something I practice on a regular basis. What are your thoughts?
Listen, intermittent fasting is really up to you and your body and how it feels. One important piece of information to keep in mind is that it's really key to break your fast in a way that doesn't create a big glucose spike. Because when your stomach is really empty, after a fast, anything you put in your system is going to get absorbed very quickly into your bloodstream. And so when you're fasted, it's really key to start with something savory, not something sweet. And if you can, to actually start with vegetables, with fibers, so that you create that protective mesh in your upper intestine to help your body deal with whatever glucose and fructose is coming down afterwards.
We got really into the nuances there, the glucose spike. I want to talk about the reactive hypoglycemia. Is this something, because the way I understood it from your book, it's something that people that have metabolic challenges are going to experience more. But I would assume somebody who has like a piece of chocolate cake, that will affect them as well after they have that spike. So I'd love for you to talk about who that's impacting and that piece of the puzzle here.
So in terms of who that's impacting, I actually don't know. It can happen in many different people, and you can be diagnosed with reactive hypoglycemia without having, for example, type 2 diabetes. I've noticed it in myself a few times, actually, really intense swings. And so reactive hypoglycemia is the process by which after a glucose spike, after your body brings out insulin to bring glucose back down to normal levels, something happens, too much insulin is produced, and your glucose levels drop below baseline for a while. And, the drop can be more or less pronounced. And that drop makes you really, really hungry and have a lot of cravings. And reactive hypoglycemia, if you have it, you're often told to just keep eating every 2 or 3 hours to bring your glucose levels back up. And often you're told to eat something sweet. The problem with that approach is that, yes, you're shooting your glucose level back up, but it's also just going to come crashing down again. And you become, a prisoner of this vicious cycle of eating all the time. What you really want to try to do is reduce your overall insulin levels so that reactive hypoglycemia just is not happening as much anymore. So you want to solve the underlying cause. You want to flatten those first glucose spikes so that the crash is less pronounced.
And this ties into what a lot of dietary advice, even today, where people will say you want to have a lot of small meals throughout the day to balance out your blood sugar. And what you're saying here is different.
It really depends on the meals, right? Because if you're having 6 small meals a day and the meals are just starches and sugars, you're creating spike, drop, spike, drop, spike, drop, spike, drop. So your glucose levels are actually not balanced. They're really volatile and you're getting a lot of consequences. If your 6 meals a day do not create spikes because they're mostly protein, fat, and fiber, then, by all means, go for it. But it's not just about the number of meals. It's about what's in the meals and is that creating a spike or not?
I want to get into my favorite hack in the book, and this is including vinegar either before, during, or after a meal. This one is just something people can do right away, and it's very cost effective, and it has a profound effect on blood sugar. So talk about what type of vinegar and the nuances of applying that.
Yeah, so the science shows us the following. If before a meal you have a tall glass of water with a tablespoon of vinegar in it, it can be any vinegar, but avoid the sort of very sweet balsamics because those have leftover sugars, so it kind of defeats the purpose. If you do that before a meal, you curb the glucose spike of that meal by up to 30%. And this is really cool because you're still eating the same meal as usual, but you're reducing the glucose spike. So you're reducing the side effects on your health, on your short-term and long-term health, on how you feel and how your body is doing. Very simple, very easy. And in the studies, it shows that it's even helping people with type 2 diabetes put their diabetes into remission. It's helping people lose weight. It's helping, small studies, but it's helping women with polycystic ovarian syndrome reduce their testosterone levels and get their period back. So super effective, really. And especially if you suffer from cravings, having this vinegar drink before eating something sweet is very, very helpful.
And I noticed in the book you emphasize having it in a tall glass of water. Is that part important, or can you just have a shot of apple cider vinegar?
So it's best to dilute it. And actually, it's even best to use a straw if you can, just to help your teeth. From a biological standpoint, the shot would work the same, but it's just, those precautions are quite helpful still. I always dilute it just to be cautious. I don't want to hurt my enamel.
So the recommendation's about a tablespoon. People can work up to that over time.
Exactly.
Is this something you're doing each and every meal? Or is this something you'll do just when you're having a lot of glucose in a meal?
It's kind of the same thing as all the other hacks. I do most of them all the time because I just feel better. So there's no reason not to do them. For the vinegar one, I just finished a vinegar drink. And it wasn't before a meal. It was just because I was home and I thought, oh, what drink could I have before the podcast? And it just felt like a nice thing to have anytime during the day. is going to be helpful. So even in the studies that they show people just doing the vinegar drink first thing in the morning, it's also helpful. The most helpful time is before a meal, but anytime you can incorporate it is fine.
The other thing that jumps out at me when considering having a big glass of water with vinegar is diluting stomach acid and enzymes. Is this something you came across in your research? Because a lot of people recommend not having any beverages when you're eating to make sure to keep your digestion stoked and working its best. So does the research show that it's impacted at all by having that big glass of water?
That's really interesting. You know, it's funny you should mention this because just today I was starting to look at these studies on drinking during meals, and I don't have the answer yet. I have to look into it, but it's definitely very intriguing to me. That'll be my next area of research. I'll report back.
Okay, great. No, it just, as I'm reading that and we're discussing here, it comes to my mind because that's always been something I've been conscious about. Not that I totally avoid drinking when I'm eating, but I'm aware and I don't just chug back a ton of water. So again, that comes back to the shot that we talked about earlier and how you recommend putting it with the water for now.
It's tough because we also know, for example, that if you're dehydrated, you're going to spike more. But yet you're saying that we should not drink during meals too much. So it's like, oh, you know, when do I drink? But I guess the solution is like drink between meals, make sure you're hydrated. And I would assume that just a glass of water would not make such a massive difference to your digestive enzymes, but I could be wrong. I would assume you don't want to chug like glasses and glasses and glasses, but maybe just a vinegar drink would be helpful.
Well, I'm going to be curious to hear what you come up with because this could be another one of those myths that you debunk, like the carbs, having them at the end of the meal, where people think, you know, you got to have them at the beginning or you get that gut rot, which you've debunked. So maybe this will be another one of those.
Yes, sir.
You're on it. So another one we can get into, and the great thing about all these hacks is that they're inexpensive, easy to perform. We can begin today and apply them. And what you're alluding to is that you can stack them on each other as well. So it's not like, okay, I'm going to do the apple cider vinegar for this meal by itself. It's like, okay, you can get the order of what you're eating, plus the vinegar, plus what I want to talk about right now, exercising after the meal, and stack them together to get exponential benefits.
Yeah, you really use them as tools in your toolbox, you know. It's these are principles based on how your biochemistry works, and they should become your friends and you can use them whenever it makes sense. So the walking after meals thing, it's quite simple. So after a meal, if you use your muscles for 10 minutes, this can be walking, this can be dancing in your living room, it can be folding your laundry, cleaning your apartment, whatever. Doing this will help reduce the glucose spike of the meal you just had. And that's because as your muscles contract, they need glucose to do that, to get energy. And the first place they're going to look for this energy is in your bloodstream. And after you've just had a meal, and let's say that meal was going to create a big glucose spike, as the glucose gets into your blood, if you use your muscles, they're going to soak it up, therefore reducing the concentration in your blood, therefore reducing the glucose spike.
So if somebody's going to be going out for dinner and they're going to be with friends, they know they're going to be having some glucose, some starches or sugars at that meal, but they're not going to be able to go for a walk afterwards. Can they go for a walk beforehand or do some kind of exercise beforehand to still get that benefit?
You can. Exercise anytime during the day is always going to be beneficial. But yes, actually, you can do it before as well. It's not as effective in the studies. They show that after the meal is better. But yeah, before is also very helpful because then you're making your muscles hungrier and whatever glucose you give them will be absorbed a bit faster too.
Another one of the hacks that ties into some of the other ones we discussed is having greens at the beginning of your meal, which again ties into the order thing, having your vegetables at the beginning. But why specifically greens before you have anything else?
Well, because of the fiber, because vegetables, and it can be any kind of vegetable, by the way. I call it a green starter because it's just easier to remember, but it can be any type of vegetables at the beginning of your meal. Again, because the fiber in them, when it lands first in your stomach, coats your intestine. And so you reduce the glucose spike of the meal afterwards. You feel full for longer, fewer of the glucose and fructose molecules even make it into your bloodstream. Overall, it really, really helps you with your energy levels, reducing cravings for the rest of the day. It's super powerful. And I do that all the time. Like I cannot even envision a meal without a green starter or a vegetable starter at the beginning because I just feel so much better when I do it.
One thing I was just thinking about is the fact that when we exercise, this ties back, I'm shifting back to the exercise piece. When we exercise, we're bringing blood away from the digestive system to the working muscles. I'm curious if you've come across anything about impacting digestion in a negative way. You're getting the glucose benefit, but are you pulling away from blood being, working with your digestive system?
I have no idea, actually. That's a really good question. I wonder, because we're not talking about, vigorous, intense exercise. We're talking about something as low intensity as walking. And you find that in many cultures, there's these traditions of walking after meals. In India, there's that famous saying of 100 steps after each meal. So I actually feel like I digest better if I move a little bit after my meal, but maybe that's just personal.
Maybe there's just different pros and cons. A lot of times when we walk too, we're going to get the social benefit if we're walking with somebody else. And you have to weigh out the whole situation. It's not usually black and white.
Yeah, and actually to that point, glucose is not everything. So glucose is an interesting prism through which to view, food and how to help your body thrive. But there are many things that keep our glucose levels flat that are not good for us. So we have to be really mindful. For example, alcohol will reduce the glucose spike of a meal, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily good for your body. In fact, it's not. Similarly, if you add a kilo of butter to a piece of bread, the glucose spike will be smaller, but that's not a healthy thing to do. Your body is not going to like having that kilo of butter to deal with. So we have to nuance everything. We have to understand the different perspectives and that glucose is not everything. Yet, even if it's not everything, I really have seen that it is the most fundamental piece of our health to get into an optimal space to then build upon, because 90% of us suffer from too much glucose, too many glucose spikes. And when we avoid those, so many good things fall into place.
Let's come back to the alcohol piece there, because I heard you say that alcohol not only doesn't impact glucose, it helps bring the spike down. So let's talk about the physiology there. And because there's a lot of people out there that like to have a drink with dinner or a drink in the evening. Let's talk about glucose and alcohol and the nuances.
For sure. So that's something that I noticed on my own glucose monitor. If I had, let's say, pasta on its own versus pasta with a glass of wine, the pasta and wine combo created a smaller spike. So I was like, what's happening? Like, why? What does this mean? And what I found out is that when you drink alcohol, you are overwhelming your liver. And your liver is in charge of releasing alcohol into your bloodstream. And when you of releasing glucose into your bloodstream. And so when you give your liver alcohol to deal with, it can no longer perform its duty of releasing glucose into the bloodstream. You're essentially poisoning your liver. And as a result, you're seeing a smaller glucose spike. But this does not mean that overall it's beneficial. It's really just this false smaller spike when actually you're really harming your body with that alcohol in the first place.
And Jessie, given what you know about glucose, its impact on the body, are you somebody that still will periodically have like a croissant or a piece of chocolate cake using some of these hacks? Or is that, off the table for you?
Oh my God, dude, like, of course. I mean, I eat sugar probably every day. This is not... I just love carbs. They make me happy. But I've learned how to eat them in a way that, one, I no longer have these uncontrollable cravings for them. And two, when I do eat them, I'm not harming my body too much in the process, So it's about being educated, understanding this stuff. But I personally am not on any extreme diet. I just use the hacks because they've helped me heal. I feel amazing when I use them. And it's just really cool to see that you don't have to do something so strict and restrictive and you can see so many benefits on your health.
And I know part of your story is experimenting with different diets. You talk about in your book, trying out the vegan diet for a period of time, trying the keto diet. Talk about those dietary experiments and what they led to.
Well, what I learned from them is that any dogma can be abused. There is one type of vegan diet that's really healthy, one type of vegan diet that's really unhealthy. Same for keto. Regardless of what you're doing, there are different ways to do it. So when I was vegan, I was eating pasta and Oreos. Basically, that was it. And when I was on keto, I was eating butter and cheese. And in both cases, my health got worse because I wasn't doing those diets in a healthy way. And so I just stepped away from sort of extreme dietary lifestyles because they just don't suit me and they demand a lot of work to be done well. I'm more in the camp now of just, eat a little bit of everything, understand when to eat them, how to eat them. Of course, depending on where you are in your health journey, what symptoms or what conditions you're trying to improve, like there's a place for the keto diet, of course, for people who have a specific objective. But once your glucose levels are steady, I think there's a lot of benefit in understanding how to include all types of foods in a diet in a way that's most beneficial to your body.
Well, now that we've gotten into the details of the hacks, let's go through a typical day of what you would eat and how you apply those hacks so we can see them used in a practical way.
Okay, so breakfast this morning, I had an omelet and a piece of avocado on toast. So I mostly had the omelet first and then the avocado toast. And so the hack for the morning is have a savory breakfast, not a sweet one. Then I went for a walk. Walking after your meals is super beneficial. For lunch, I had salad, lentils, salmon, and quinoa, more or less in that order. Again, I do mix some bites. I'm not doing this really intensely, but when it's easy to have the salad first and to have a nice veggie starter, that's what I do. And tonight, I think I'm going to have Indian food. Not too sure yet. And I just had a vinegar drink. So, I kind of incorporate that whenever I can, whenever it makes sense, whenever I want to. But yeah, close on my carbs is something that I do when I snack, for example. So if I want to have some chocolate cake, I'll have some almonds, maybe some Greek yogurt with it as well. Every day is a bit different, but the hacks are there with me all the time.
It's so interesting because, again, these are such relatively simple and inexpensive things to apply, and I don't see a lot of people talking about them. And maybe that's why your community has erupted the way it has. And I went on Amazon before our conversation, and the reviews for your book are phenomenal. You're bringing this unique perspective to the world that is just so necessary.
Thank you, Jessie. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Let's talk about the growth of the community. I know this started out as a personal experiment and then went to friends and family and then organically turned into this glucose goddess Instagram account and this flourishing community. Get into the nuances of what that was like growing the community and how this is, transformed what you do day to day in your life.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's a trip for sure. I never expected it to become this big. I never expected to write a book. I've just been responding to people asking me to share this broader and louder, to people telling me how much it's helped them. At the beginning, so I was able to heal myself and I felt so much better. So I started sharing the glucose graphs and all the science I was discovering with my friends and my family. And they then asked me to put this online so they could share it with their friends and families. So I started an Instagram account because the basis of my work was around these glucose graphs. So I thought it would be quite helpful. And then I just had this feeling that maybe I could turn this into what I did for a living. And so I told myself, for 6 months, I'm going to commit to working on this an hour and a half a day. Whether it pours, whatever, I'm going to do that. And that was really important because that got me to the first level, as in I spent 6 months understanding how to explain the science to people, what was most communicative, what was most shareable, what was most interesting and helpful to people. And then also I grew, the community maybe to 5,000 people. It was still relatively small back then, but that gave me an instinct and some confidence that yes, I could do it and there was something there. So then I just went full time. And it's a lot of work, but it's super rewarding. I feel really proud that I share this information. Of course, it's difficult because social media is a difficult environment, but I get so much joy out of people getting better and sending me messages about how their lives have been transformed by this science. And yeah, it just feels like the universe maybe, put me here to talk about this. So I want to do this justice and I want to do it as well and as nuanced and as helpful and as far as possible. and we'll see.
Well, what I see is that you're somebody that understands the science, went into the science, and pulled all these hacks out, and then you're presenting them in a way that people can understand them and with visuals. I mean, seeing these graphs, and I want you to talk about this. Part of your story is you came up with software to display these graphs in a different way and give people the visual. So to me, you have all the pieces and it makes sense why it's working the way it does. And also your health story and being tied into overcoming the challenges there. Talk about the software you created and how you're able to share these pictures on Instagram that depict what the science is showing.
So when I first discovered the science of glucose and I was trying to heal myself, it worked. But then when I wanted to share the science with my friends, I kept showing them these scientific papers, I was printing them out and being like, hey, look at this cool paper. And people don't respond in a very excited way to seeing a scientific paper if they're not scientists. So I thought, I've got a communication issue here. I've got I need to make this more fun, more appealing, more understandable. So I thought, hey, what if I use my own glucose data from my own glucose monitor to illustrate the science that's been discovered? So I do not use my own data to create the hacks or create the principles. I use my data to illustrate scientific discoveries that already exist in, peer-reviewed, published literature. And so at the time I was wearing the glucose monitor and it was impossible to extract the data in an easy way or make these comparison charts. So I wrote this little piece of software on my computer that took in a screenshot of the app and digitized the curve point by point and then stored that in a database. And then in R, that piece of software that I was using in grad school, I then recreated the curves using the digitized data and I turn them into these cool side-by-side comparison graphs. But it was a journey, but I had a feeling that was going to be the best way to show it to people. And if you scroll back all the way back on my Instagram, like when it first started 3 years ago, you'll see how different they used to look. I mean, the same idea was still there, but the graphs were a bit more clunky. And it's really cool to have that history right there to go back to. And over time, I think I've understood in a deeper way how to communicate science to people. And it's been super cool. And I'm really proud of these visual graphs that people are seeing all around the world now.
One of the subjects you really like to talk about is the calories in, calories out. And this fits into everything we're talking about here today because, people start to decide to eat differently, to impact their glucose differently. And then they might start thinking, okay, calories, what I was having before had this many calories. Now I'm taking in more calories. The way that you emphasize people eat to benefit their glucose spikes is actually consuming more calories. So talk about what, and that's nuance. I want you to talk about that. You go over that in the book, but let's talk about that specific instance and then calories in general. Let's pick that apart and debunk a lot of the myths there.
Yeah. So I do not tell people to eat more calories. I mean, the one hack that actually tells you to add food is the hack about adding a vegetable-based starter to the beginning of your meals. And so a question I would get is like, well, wouldn't adding these calories from the vegetable starter make me gain weight? And actually the answer is no, because when you add calories from vegetables, number one, you're coating your intestine, so you're absorbing fewer of the calories of the rest of the meal. And number two, health doesn't happen in a vacuum on every food choice. Health is something that accumulates based on all the decisions you make in a week, a month, a year. And when you add those calories of vegetables, what you're doing is you're flattening your glucose curves. So overall, you're less hungry, you have fewer cravings for sweet foods, you have steadier energy, you sleep better. So it all combines to this situation where you're much healthier than before. And picking a food based on its number of calories is not really helpful. I mean, of course, if you compare a 1,000 calorie ice cream to 5,000 calorie ice cream, yeah, probably the 1,000 calorie ice cream is a better choice because it's just a volume thing. So calories are helpful in the way that they discuss volume or quantity. But if you compare 100 calories of a donut versus 100 calories of a Greek yogurt, the 100 calories here and there are not the same because the 100 calories of donuts are going to create a big glucose spike, then a big glucose crash. And over a day, this is going to make you have more cravings, be hungrier, you're going to consume more food, your health is not going to be better. If you have the 100 calories of Greek yogurt instead, Greek yogurt does not spike your glucose levels because it's mostly protein and fat. Your glucose levels will be steadier, you won't have as many cravings, your hunger will be tamed, you'll have more energy. So overall, that accumulates to a situation where your body is healthier and potentially you lose weight because that's often one of the consequences of flattening your glucose curves. So yeah, just thinking about calories, I think is really quite outdated. I want to teach people about the molecules in the food so that they have that information to make decisions based on.
When it comes to the molecules in the food, you talked about Greek yogurt there. A lot of people these days in the health and wellness space avoid dairy, or at least cow dairy. I'm curious on your thoughts. Is that something that you've researched? And this is outside the glucose perspective, but just people being sensitive to that.
Yeah, so there are a lot of people who are lactose intolerant. So for those, obviously it's not a good option. But if you're able to find, high quality dairy, it's a really good source of protein, really good source of fat. I personally go for cow's milk. I mean, I was on the almond milk train for a while, but then I was like, environmentally, it's kind of shitty. I mean, there's pros and cons to everything, for sure. But from what I've seen, high quality dairy, whole milk, good source of protein and fat, not a huge deal from my perspective. But if it doesn't agree with you, definitely, listen to your body and make choices based on that. And there's cool studies showing, for example, the impact of glucose spikes versus dairy on acne. And we used to think that, acne and inflammatory-based diseases were largely driven by eating dairy. But now what we're starting to see is that actually, if you flatten your glucose spikes, you can avoid or reduce your acne without even taking out the dairy from your diet. So the conversation is shifting. I think the jury is still out. Listen to your body, see what works for you. I'm not going to tell you to drink or not drink dairy or whatever you want, but yeah, for me it works.
And when people in your community start harnessing these hacks and controlling their glucose, how quickly do they start to see changes? How quickly does inflammation start to come down and they start to feel better?
I wish I had like a study that could tell you exactly, but all I have are stories of people. So I can tell you many people see improvements within a day. They have more energy, they don't have cravings, they sleep better, they wake up, they're finally refreshed after all these years of waking up feeling really crappy. And then, of course, benefits compound. So over a week, you might see that your energy is really improving. You might see your skin clearing up. Over a month, you might see, if you're a woman, more regular period, much easier premenstrual syndrome, fewer cramps, fewer mood swings. You might see weight loss. And then if you're, battling a chronic condition, it'll take weeks or months for you to see the difference. But people have been putting the diabetes into remission, for example, in a matter of months.
And when somebody say they have diabetes and they start taking on these hacks, I'm assuming, and you do talk about this in your book, so I'm actually sure you do stand behind this, you want people to work with their doctor, because what's going to happen is if they're taking insulin in and they're starting to control their glucose, they could run into trouble.
Yeah, so my work is to bring these scientific studies into the light and give them to people so they can use them as tools in their own healing. So 100%, whatever the condition you have is, bring to your doctor these studies that are in the book, tell them about the hacks, and make a plan with them to incorporate them in a way that you're still being monitored and medication is adjusted if necessary. But look at the studies, learn about the science, understand how this all works, and you'll get a much clearer picture of what you can do to improve your health when you understand the mechanisms behind all this. And that's what I hope, you read the book, and I hope that I hope that you felt that I was really trying to explain the science so that everybody was armed with this information. I'm not just, blurting out what to do. It's like, here's how your body works. I'm going to take you on this journey. And hopefully at the end, you're a bit more informed about your own biology.
No, you did a great job of that. Like I was saying
Thanks,
before,
Jessie.
you've taken this complicated science and made it easy for people to apply into their day-to-day life, which is just so needed.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Let's talk about the gluten piece. Because when we talk about starches and sugars, oftentimes these are found with gluten, in bread or in cakes and cookies. Are you anti-gluten, or what are your thoughts on that?
I'm really not anti anything. But what's important to remember is that gluten is a protein. And so if you pick a gluten-free product, oftentimes the gluten-free products are actually going to create a bigger glucose spike in your body than the products with gluten because they have less protein. So it's really important to put some clothes on those gluten-free carbs. So, add some avocado, add some fresh vegetables, add some eggs, et cetera, to curb the spike. But gluten, no gluten, I don't have an opinion.
When you're in France, you're having croissants and bread.
Oh, dude. Absolutely. I mean, I eat gluten all the time, but that's just me and my body and it works for me. But I have many friends who can't handle it and it makes them bloat, it makes them feel poorly. So we have to figure out what works for our body. Not one thing is going to work for everybody. And it's all about experimentation and figuring it out. But yeah, I eat the croissants for sure.
Do you spend part of your time in the US and part of your time in France?
Yeah, no, I live in the US and I'm here in France because we're doing the press tour for the French book, which is going really well. So I've been here for a few weeks and it's been really, really good. I'm super happy that it's been received so well in France as well. But yeah, now I'm in the US. I'm a US girl.
When did you come over to the US?
When I was 20. So 45 years ago.
And was that working for 23andMe that brought you over?
First, I actually moved to Philadelphia and I was working at Penn as a visiting researcher. I was working on a really cool project about predicting world events and I was writing algorithms. That's where I learned R, which has turned out to be very helpful. And then I went to DC to do grad school in biochemistry. And then when I was 23, I moved to San Francisco for 23andMe.
Yeah, I guess 23andMe wouldn't have been around that far back.
Yeah, no.
You shared your health journey. Part of, actually what got you to doing what you do today is your own personal health journey and getting to the bottom of that. I know the physical part of your surgery and your spine, that healed relatively quickly. Then the mental aspect, getting your blood glucose under control really helped with that.
Yeah.
How is the mental aspect these days as you continue to learn and apply all this great knowledge to managing your blood glucose and health? How are you feeling mentally these days?
Thank you for that lovely question. I feel pretty good. So the glucose steadying part was kind of the foundation to feel good. And now I'm very interested in stress management. How do you sleep well? How do you process intense emotions when they come about? How do you reduce your stress in stressful situations? From what I'm doing now, I'm quite exposed. Every day is different to the next. I get last minute, intense requests for stuff and I have to manage that. So I've gotten really into things like EMDR, tapping, earthing, grounding, understanding how to get my nervous system back to a place that is relaxed, even in a stressful environment. But I could have never gotten to this point if I hadn't first fixed my glucose. That was really the first layer. And now I'm optimizing all the other stuff. But I'm very interested in mental health. I think it's really, really interesting and exciting. And I hope to do more in that field, actually.
And when it comes to regulating your nervous system, is meditation a piece of that?
Sometimes. But for me, I found that physical based practices are more helpful. So shaking, dancing, putting my feet and my hands on the wet grass and just letting my electrons go into the earth. For me, those work better. I did meditate for a long time, and I've just kind of gotten off that habit, but it's phases. So it definitely helped me a lot when I was doing it. Yeah.
Jessie, really enjoyed the conversation. Loved your book. You've given us so much practical information people can apply right away. We're going to link up the book, link up your social media. Thank you for the work you're doing.
Thank you, Jessie, for having me. And I have to say, you have a great name.
Love yours too. Thank you.
Bye.
Stick around for my conversation with Dr. Robert Lustig. We get into sugar and how it's actually a poison for your body.
It's poison. And it actually detracts from metabolic health. And we have the data to show how and why. Because